Look, I've been in this business long enough to know when something's about to cross a line. And right now, we're standing at that line. The phone rings at 2 a.m. Same conversation these days. Dana, what do you think about this influencer fight? Dana, should we consider crossover events? Dana, the numbers don't lie. I sit in my Vegas office, looking at numbers they're showing me. Jake Paul just fought Anthony Joshua. Kid lasted 6 rounds before AJ put him down. Pay-per-view numbers? Astronomical. Social media engagement? Through the roof. Traditional boxing audience mixed with YouTube kids? Gold mine nobody saw coming. But here's what they don't understand. The UFC isn't just another entertainment company. We're not chasing quick money. We built something that took decades to create. I remember sitting in that office 15 years ago, fighting athletic commissions just to get sanctioned. Senator John McCain calling us human cockfighting. Networks wouldn't touch us. We were banned in more states than allowed. Everyone wants to copy what we built, but they want shortcuts. They see the success and think it happened overnight. They don't see the decisions, the compromises we refuse to make. Jake Paul phenomenon is testing every principle we've held for 25 years. When I watch him fight, I see something dangerous. Not dangerous like real fighters. Dangerous like a loaded gun in wrong hands. He's skilled enough to believe he belongs, but not skilled enough to actually belong. The worst part is how convinced he's become of his own narrative. That confidence becomes contagious, spreads to his fans, creates this bubble where YouTube metrics somehow equal fighting credentials. The worst part? The money makes it seem legitimate. When you're grossing $50 million on a single event, breaking social media records, getting mainstream coverage, it becomes harder to say no. My phone keeps buzzing with messages from fighters, managers, promoters. When are we going to get our piece of this? But every time I'm about to consider it, I remember something my old boxing coach told me. The moment you compromise your standards for money, you're not in the fight business anymore. You're in the money business. Every rule we have exists for a reason. Not because some lawyer wrote it down, but because blood was spilled learning it. When people ask me about bringing influencers into the octagon, they think it's just about money. They see Jake Paul lasting 6 rounds with Joshua and think, hey, this guy can fight. They see Logan Paul almost beating Floyd in exhibitions and think these influencers are athletes. What they don't see is what happens when cameras stop rolling. I've watched fighters who trained their entire lives get carried out on stretchers. I've seen careers end in seconds. I've had to call mothers and tell them their sons are in the hospital. Tim Sylvia broke his arm against Frank Mir in the first round. You could hear the bone snap on television. Tim kept fighting for 30 seconds before the referee stopped it. That's the toughness our fighters operate at. Anderson Silva snapped his leg against Chris Weidman. The sound haunted me for months. These are legends who understand pain and damage better than anyone, and even they couldn't avoid the inherent dangers. Now imagine putting someone in there whose biggest adversity was getting criticized in a YouTube comment section. These influencers trained for months, maybe a year. Our fighters train their entire lives. The skill gap isn't just wide, it's a chasm. When you put someone in that octagon who doesn't belong there, people get hurt. Careers get damaged. Legacies get tainted. I remember when James Toney came over from boxing to fight Randy Couture. Toney was a world champion boxer with decades of experience. Randy took him down in the first exchange and submitted him in 2 minutes. Toney never recovered. A Hall of Fame boxer became a punchline. That was with a real champion. Imagine what happens with a YouTuber. The pressure keeps building. Every week, someone walks through my door with another proposal. What if we did a special exhibition? What if we created a separate division? The answer is always the same. No, not because I'm against making money, but because I've seen what happens when you prioritize entertainment over safety. I've seen what happens when you put people in situations they're not prepared for. The commission meetings I've sat through, the medical reports I've reviewed, the insurance claims I've had to approve, they all tell the same story. This sport is dangerous enough when everyone involved knows what they're doing. When you introduce people who don't understand the consequences, the danger multiplies exponentially. Here's what really gets me about this whole influencer boxing phenomenon. Everyone wants to focus on the success stories, but nobody talks about the close calls. Jake Paul versus Anthony Joshua looked competitive for 5 rounds. People saw that and thought, see, the gap isn't that big. What they didn't see was Joshua holding back. What they didn't see was a professional boxer being careful not to seriously hurt someone who didn't belong in there with him. In the UFC, Nobody holds back. You can't. The moment you do, you lose. And when you don't hold back against someone who isn't prepared for that level of violence, that's when disasters happen. I remember the early days when we were still figuring out what this sport could become. We had guys coming in from different backgrounds, wrestlers, boxers, kickboxers, and even then, with legitimate martial arts experience, we saw some ugly moments. Fighters getting hurt because they didn't understand the full scope of mixed martial arts. Tank Abbott versus John Machua at UFC 6. Tank knocked John unconscious, but John's body was still standing up, completely stiff. It was one of the most disturbing things I'd ever seen in combat sports. And that was between two legitimate fighters who understood the risks. Gerard Gordo eye-gouging Royce Gracie at UFC 1. Eye pokes happen in fights. But when someone doesn't understand the unwritten rules, the respect that keeps fighters from permanently damaging each other, that's when you get real problems. Now imagine putting someone in there whose biggest fight was against another YouTuber. But the money talks. It always does. The Jake Paul-Joshua fight generated more revenue in one night than some of our smaller events do in 6 months. The social media reach was massive. Suddenly, everyone's an expert on combat sports business. Dana, you're missing out. Dana, you're being stubborn. Dana, adapt or get left behind. My business advisors show me projections. If we did one Jake Paul versus Sean O'Malley fight, the numbers would be insane. Jake's got 27 million YouTube subscribers. Sean's got 3 million Instagram followers. The crossover audience would break every record. But what happens when Sean decides he doesn't need to hold back? What happens when a real UFC fighter treats Jake Paul like any other opponent? What happens when someone gets seriously hurt on live television because we thought viral fame was equivalent to fighting skill? Maybe they're right about the business side. Maybe I am being stubborn. But when I go to sleep at night, I don't have to worry about some kid getting permanently damaged because we thought social media followers meant fighting ability. The commission doctors I work with have been clear. Every fighter who steps into our octagon undergoes extensive medical screening. Brain scans, cardiac evaluations, blood work that would make NASA jealous. We know their injury history, family medical history, psychological profile. What do we know about Jake Paul's chin? How does his brain handle repeated trauma? What happens when he faces someone who punches twice as hard as Anthony Joshua, but with 4-ounce gloves? These aren't questions I'm willing to find answers to on pay-per-view. The thing about control is that you don't realize how much you have until someone tries to take it from you. For 20 years, I've built the UFC into something that matters. We've created a sport where the best fight the best, where rankings mean something, where when you win the belt, you earned it against killers. Now, everyone wants to throw that out for a quick payday. The boxing world went down this path. Look where it got them. Championships don't mean what they used to. You've got YouTube stars fighting retired legends, while actual contenders wait for scraps. Tyson Fury fighting Francis Ngannou in boxing. Francis looked competitive for 10 rounds against one of the best heavyweight boxers, and he'd never had a professional boxing match. What does that say about boxing? Francis is a legitimate badass, but he's an MMA fighter, not a boxer. The fact that he could hang with Fury tells you everything. I've watched boxing promoters chase crossover fights. The real fighters got pushed aside. Guys who dedicated their lives to the craft became undercard material, while influencers headlined pay-per-views. Deontay Wilder went from being one of the most feared punchers to being a stepping stone for circus acts. Genuine contenders can't get title shots because promoters are booking retired basketball players and social media personalities. That's not happening in the UFC. Not on my watch. But pressure isn't just coming from outside. It's coming from inside too. Fighters see the money these influencer fights generate. Why can't we do that? They ask. Jorge Masvidal called out Jake Paul personally. Jorge's been doing this for 20 years, but even he sees the payday and thinks it's worth the risk. Nate Diaz actually boxed Jake Paul after leaving the UFC. Got beaten up for 10 rounds, made millions, and probably took more damage than his last 3 UFC fights combined. The moment we do that, we become a circus instead of a sport. Social media changed everything. Fighters now are brands first, athletes second. They need to build followings, create content, generate buzz. Sean O'Malley figured this out better than anyone. He's got skills to back up the persona, but he's also a content machine. He's built a following that rivals these influencers, but he did it while being a legitimate fighter. Paddy Pimblett is another guy who gets it. Natural entertainer, genuine personality. But he's also a problem for anyone at 155 pounds. Marketing yourself is part of the modern fight game. But when marketing becomes more important than fighting, that's when we lose what makes this special. The moment we start booking fights based on Instagram followers instead of rankings, we're not the UFC anymore. We're TikTok with violence. I've had meetings with streaming platforms, social media companies, cryptocurrency investors. Everyone wants to get into the fight business now. They all have the same pitch. We can bring you younger audiences. We can make you more money. We can make you more relevant. What they don't understand is that relevance without authenticity is just noise. And noise doesn't last. Conor McGregor changed everything. I'll be the first to admit that. Before Conor, fighters were athletes who happened to be entertaining. After Conor, entertainment became part of the athletic requirement. He showed everyone that personality and performance could coexist at the highest level. But here's the difference. Conor could back it all up. Every word he spoke, every prediction he made, he had the skills to validate in the octagon. He wasn't just an entertainer who could fight. He was a fighter who could entertain. The night he knocked out Jose Aldo in 13 seconds, I knew we were witnessing something special. Not just the knockout. Anyone can get lucky. But the way he had predicted it, sold it to the world beforehand. The influencer boxing world got it backwards. They're entertainers first who learned to fight just enough to not embarrass themselves. That's a fundamental difference people don't understand. When Jake Paul calls out UFC fighters, he's calling out the fighting ability. That's where the line gets drawn. I've had conversations with Conor about this influencer phenomenon. He sees it differently. Dana, these guys are bringing new eyes to combat sports, he says. He's not wrong about the exposure. Jake Paul probably introduced more young people to combat sports in 2 years than we did in 5. But exposure to what? To real fighting or to performance art? There's also the Conor Floyd fight to consider. That was the blueprint everyone's trying to copy. But that worked because you had 2 legitimate combat sports champions crossing over. Floyd was the best boxer. Conor was the UFC champion. Both brought authentic credentials. The build-up was insane. The press tour broke attendance records. The trash talk was legendary. The final pay-per-view numbers were astronomical, 4.3 million buys. But even in that fight, you could see the difference in boxing skill. Floyd dominated Conor once he figured out the timing. It was competitive for a few rounds, but the outcome was never in doubt. These influencer fights don't have that authenticity. They're manufactured from the ground up for content and clicks. But I can't ignore the numbers. The engagement, the pay-per-view buys, the social media buzz, it's all real. And it's all massive. The question keeps coming back. How do we capture that energy without compromising what we've built? How do we bring in new audiences without alienating the ones who made us what we are? UFC 229 taught me that even the most controlled environment can explode in seconds. Khabib versus Conor was supposed to be the perfect storm. 2 legitimate champions, a real grudge, massive global interest. Everything was aligned for the biggest night in UFC history. Then it all went to hell after the final bell. Khabib jumped the cage. Conor got attacked by Khabib's team. The whole place erupted. For 10 minutes, we lost complete control of everything we'd spent months planning. That night showed me what happens when the entertainment side overwhelms the sporting side. The buildup got so intense, so personal, that it couldn't be contained inside the octagon. The buildup was unlike anything we'd done before. Conor's attack on the bus at UFC 223. Khabib's father and teammates getting hurt. Months of personal insults, cultural attacks, religious disrespect. By fight night, there was legitimate bad blood beyond promotion. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there. During fight week, both teams had to be kept separate. The press conferences were tense. Even the weigh-ins felt dangerous. But the money was too good. The story was too compelling. We had sold out T-Mobile Arena in minutes. Pay-per-view pre-orders were breaking records. When Khabib submitted Conor in the 4th round, I thought the story was over. Justice served. The better fighter won. Then Khabib threw his mouthpiece at Dylan Dennis and jumped the cage. What happened next was chaos. Pure, uncontrolled chaos. Khabib's teammates jumped into the octagon and attacked Conor. Security tried to restore order while Khabib fought in the crowd. 20,000 people were screaming. Police rushed in from everywhere. For those 10 minutes, I wasn't the president of the UFC. I wasn't in control of anything. I was just another guy watching a sporting event turn into a street fight. And for the first time in decades, I questioned whether I'd lost control of what I'd built, whether the monster had gotten too big for even me to handle. Here's what really bothered me. We had created the conditions that made that explosion inevitable. The personal attacks, the cultural disrespect, the manufactured hatred. We had pushed it to sell pay-per-views, then lost control of what we created. Now imagine that same intensity, but with fighters who don't have the same level of respect for the sport. Imagine that chaos with people who are there for views instead of legacy. The influencer boxing world thrives on manufactured drama. Everything is designed to go viral. In that environment, where's the line between promotion and recklessness? Where's the line between building a fight and creating a situation nobody can control? Jake Paul understands this better than anyone. He's turned controversy into a science. Every statement, every call out, every training video, it's all calculated to generate maximum engagement. But what happens when that reality show mentality meets actual violence? What happens when someone who thinks everything is content meets someone who thinks everything is life or death? I learned from UFC 229 that even with the most professional fighters, things can spiral quickly. With influencers whose entire business model is pushing boundaries and creating controversy, that spiral happens faster and goes deeper. Here's what really keeps me up at night. What happens when one of these crossover fights goes really wrong? In boxing, they have plausible deniability. Both guys were boxers. They can say, if we bring influencers into the UFC, we don't have that protection. We become responsible for putting someone in there who everyone knew didn't belong. I'm not against evolution. I'm against devolution. When people accuse me of being stuck in the past, they're missing the point. The UFC has changed more in the last 20 years than any sport in history. We went from banned in most states to mainstream entertainment. We went from struggling to sell tickets to selling out the biggest arenas. That evolution happened because we never compromised on the fundamental principle: the best fight the best. The moment we start making exceptions for social media followers or viral fame, we're no longer the UFC. We're something else pretending to be the UFC. But I understand the business reality. Combat sports need fresh blood, new audiences, different revenue streams. The traditional model of building fighters over years isn't sustainable in a world where attention spans last seconds and careers are made overnight. The ESPN deal changed everything. Suddenly, we had access to mainstream audiences who'd never watched mixed martial arts. We had to figure out how to introduce the sport to people who thought it was just cage fighting and violence. We started doing more background pieces, more human interest stories, more content showing the athletic and technical aspects. We made the sport more accessible without making it less authentic. The question isn't whether we should evolve. It's how we evolve without losing our soul. Maybe there's a middle ground. Maybe there's a way to capture some of that influencer energy without compromising our standards. Special events, exhibition matches, different rules, different expectations. I've been exploring this more than I'd like to admit. What if we created a separate division entirely? What if we had entertainment fights that were clearly labeled as different from championship competitions? The more I think about it, though, the more problems I see. How do you maintain the integrity of your main product while also selling a watered-down version? But the moment those exhibitions start affecting rankings or title shots, we've crossed the line. The moment influencer fights become more important than real championship fights, we've lost what makes this special. Look at what happened to boxing. Tank Davis versus Ryan Garcia was huge business, but it had nothing to do with legitimate boxing championships. Anthony Joshua fighting Francis Ngannou generated massive numbers, but it pushed legitimate contenders further down the card. I've seen how this story ends. The circus acts become the main attraction, and the real sport becomes the sideshow. I've been wrong before. I've missed opportunities. I've been too stubborn about things that didn't matter and not stubborn enough about things that did. But this feels different. This feels like one of those decisions that defines what the UFC becomes for the next 20 years. We wanted to find out who the best fighter in the world was. Not the most entertaining, not the most famous, not the most viral. The best. That mission hasn't changed. And as long as I'm running this company, it won't change. But the money will always be tempting. The pressure will always be there. But I have to be able to look at myself in the mirror and know that we're still doing what we set out to do. Here's what I know. The UFC will still be here when the influencer boxing bubble bursts. And it will burst. Every entertainment trend does. The audiences move on. The novelty wears off. The money dries up. What's left are the people who are building something real while everyone else was chasing quick hits. We've survived network television trying to control us. We've survived athletic commissions trying to ban us. We've survived economic downturns and global pandemics and every other challenge thrown at legitimate businesses. We'll survive the influencer boxing trend too. But that doesn't mean we ignore it completely. The smart play is to watch, learn, and figure out what elements we can adopt without compromising what we've built. The content creation side, we're already doing that. Our fighters are better at building their brands than ever before. Sean O'Malley, Israel Adesanya, Colby Covington, they understand the game now. The crossover appeal, we're working on that too. Finding ways to bring new audiences into real fights without diluting the product. Our ESPN partnership has opened doors we never had access to before. What we're not doing is putting people in the octagon who don't belong there just because they have followers. So when people ask me about UFC fighters versus influencers, here's my answer. When an influencer can beat a ranked contender, then we can talk. When they can prove they belong with professional fighters, the conversation changes. Jake Paul wants to fight in the UFC? Fine. Start at the bottom like everyone else. Fight an unranked lightweight and see what happens. Earn your way up through legitimate competition. No special treatment, no celebrity matchmaking, no exhibition nonsense. But that's never going to happen because everyone knows how that story ends. These influencers have built careers on controlled situations. They pick opponents. They control the narrative. They script the drama. In the UFC, none of that matters. The octagon is the ultimate truth teller. You can't fake your way through a real fight with a real fighter who's been training their entire life to hurt people. Until then, they can keep making their content, building their brands, and fighting each other. We'll keep building the greatest combat sport in the world. The line exists for a reason. And as long as I'm running this company, we're not crossing it. But I'm also not naive about what's coming. The pressure is only going to increase. The money is only going to get bigger. At some point, we're going to have to make a decision that defines not just the next few years, but the next few decades of what this sport becomes. The easy thing would be to chase quick money. Book Jake Paul versus Conor McGregor. Break every pay-per-view record. Make more money in one night than some entire years. But easy things don't last. Easy money doesn't build legacies. Easy decisions don't create something that matters. I didn't get into this business to be easy. I got into it to build something that would last. Something that would matter. Something that would change the world of combat sports forever. We did that. The UFC changed everything. And I'm not going to let some YouTube trend undo 25 years of work. The conversation isn't over. The pressure isn't going away. The money isn't getting smaller. But my position isn't changing. The UFC is the premier mixed martial arts organization in the world because we've never compromised on what we are. We're not going to start now. Look, I'm not saying never. I'm saying not now, not like this. The sport has to come first. Always. These influencers want to prove they can fight. There's a path for that. It's the same path everyone else has taken. Start at the bottom, work your way up, earn your shot. But I'm not going to compromise what we've built just to chase viral moments. I'm not going to put someone in our octagon who doesn't belong there just because they have 20 million followers. The UFC means something. It represents something. And I intend to keep it that way. Will the landscape change? Maybe. Will we adapt? We always do. But we'll do it on our terms, maintaining our standards, protecting our fighters, and preserving what makes this sport special. The line in the sand isn't moving. And anyone who wants to cross it better come correct. Because I've seen what happens when you compromise. I've watched other sports lose their souls chasing quick money. That's not happening here. Not on my watch.